Welcome back to the participants of our workshop, which started in the college and now it has moved to the European Study Center. And this is the seminar room of our center. Some of you have already been here, surrounded by the Timothy Carlton Ash Library, which is a lot of recent European politics and history. For those who joined us, this is the first session of a closed panel that we had before, and now we are continuing the conversation on the Black Sea. We will also welcome Ian Lesser, who is online, and I will present him later. Hello, Ian. It is now we are continuing with the conversation on focusing more on actors. We did discuss, obviously, the significance of the Black Sea, but now we will go more into actors in the region. And with us, we have four excellent speakers that will be discussing different aspects of the Europe, US, Black Sea, Middle East insecurity. First, there is Galip Dalay, who's the co-organizer in this with me, and I have to say from the beginning that this is a tripartite cooperation between Chatham House and GMF. Galip is wearing two hats. He's Chatham House and he's Oxford, because he's also a DPhil student that needs to finish his DPhil in a few months, no later than this. Because it's very big in other events, but he needs to finish that academic year. Okay, and then next to Galip, there's Natalie Sabanadze, who's a senior research fellow at the Chatham House on Russia and Eurasia program. Welcome, Natalie. She's been also an ambassador in her life for the Georgian mission to Belgium and to Luxembourg and to the EU. Then we have Keir Giles, and this is in order of speaking as well that I'm presenting them, who's a senior consulting fellow on the Russian Eurasia program at Chatham House. Previously, he worked with the BBC Monitoring Service and the UK Defence Academy. Next is going to be Nigel Gould-Davies, who's a senior fellow for Russia and Eurasia at the IISS, International Institute for Strategic Studies. Has done a lot of work on the former Soviet Union space, on politics, economic security. Last but not least, online, we're very pleased to have you, Ian Lesser, with us. Ian is a distinguished fellow and advisor to the GMF's president. He heads the organization in Brussels office and leads GMF South, a program encompassing research and analysis of Europe, Turkey, Mediterranean, etc. He has also served himself as acting president of the GMF between 2020 and 2021, and of course previously in various other positions. He's a wonderful expert with us. Now, with that, we will start with Galip, and then we'll take the order as it follows. So I've asked them to speak for 7-8 minutes, and then we can have basically a second round of questions, but also the question and answer, and with the audience. So over to you, Galip.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you very much for the very lively conversation. That's today. It's the second session we're having. So you asked me to talk about the regional context, and I think one interesting development that we have seen since the start of the war, there has been too much focus, discussion about Ukraine, but little attention given to the regional context within which that this war was taking place, and the regional context being the Black Sea. The good part is recently there is actually more and more focus on the regional context of this war, not only on war itself, because at the end of the war, this war is not only reshaping the geopolitics of Ukraine, Russia, but it is fundamentally reshaping the geopolitics of the Black Sea region, and this is the true where we see the Russia actually poses a fundamental challenge to European security. For a long time, the idea of the regional order in the Black Sea was very much premised on the idea of the regional ownership. So in a sense, the regional order through the regional ownership, that was quite popular with Turkey. That was quite popular also. At least it's received the buy-in of the Russia itself. So therefore, the regional order through the regional ownership. Obviously, that is being made impossible, a task impossible to achieve from the start by the Russian its own actions, because the Russians' actions, which basically not recognizing the agency of the regional actors, regional states, is also very much making it impossible to have a regional order premised on regional ownership, because the regional ownership means the participation of the other littoral states, they being the stakeholder in this regional order, and recognizing their agency. Russia, by its actions, very much denying their agency, preventing their agency, and hence preventing the idea of the regional order being premised on the regional ownership. Right now, the shared common ground between Russia and Turkey, I would say, when it comes to the Black Sea regional security, is to keeping the extra regional powers out of the Black Sea maritime. And I think that's the main or the overarching shared point of the Russia and Turkey when it comes to Black Sea regional security. But there is a different aspect of it, obviously, that the Ankara will oppose the Russian bid for the dominance in the region and also support the Ukrainian capability to defend itself. So in a sense, the shared point being that there no keeping extra-regional powers out of the Black Sea maritime spheres, but then the divergence is very significant because in the end, the Russian idea is effectively premised on the idea of bringing the Cold War borders into the Black Sea, in which that it is very much dominated in the north and the Turkey is the south. And I think by its action, it is already trying to do so. Here, one of the fundamental questions for the Black Sea regional order would be whether the Ukraine will remain as a Black Sea power or not. Because I think the Ukraine remaining a Black Sea power is fundamental to prevent the Russian hegemony or Russian domination in the Black Sea, so that the Ukraine has to remain a Black Sea power in order to prevent the Russian dominance of the Black Sea. So from the Russian point of view, this is like a very bifurcated regional order in which that it is dominated more or less to the north, and the Turkey is more or less present in the south, and to some extent that's a very refashioned border of the border of the Cold War era. Obviously, I'm generalizing, but this is like more or less correspond with the Russian views. But the Russian attempt to dominate the Black Sea is actually having a reverse impact. It is pushing many Black Sea littoral states seeking further integration with the Western economic and security ecosystem. And that's what you see in the Black Sea. What now you have in the Black Sea, the 3 NATO member states, Bulgaria, Romania, Turkey, 2 NATO aspirant states, Georgia and Ukraine, and 2 EU member states, Bulgaria and Romania, and 3 officially, at least like technically, EU candidate states. So you have the 2 trends happening at the same time in the Black Sea. On the one hand, you see the increasing Russia's zone of domination, zone of occupation. 2008, Georgia, Russia basically dominating, occupying the 2/3 of the Georgian Black Sea coastline. 2014, the annexation of Crimea. 2022, the war, the invasion. So you have the trend of the Russian domination and occupation zones in the region. But equally, you see a strong drive to be integrated into the Western economic and security structures in the Black Sea, gaining quite significant space. Given that one of the central idea of Turkey, and is also a common point with Russia, about the regional order to keep the extra-regional powers out of the Black Sea, recently there has been all this conversation about whether we can induce more cooperation, coordination among the littoral states of the Black Sea, non-Russia littoral states of the Black Sea, meaning the Bulgaria, Romania, Turkey, hopefully down the road, Ukraine, Georgia. And we have seen a smaller scale test, a case studies. That was the demining activities that was undertaken between Bulgaria, Romania, and Turkey. But this can be an issue-based and limited in scope, but it cannot turn into a comprehensive containment strategy towards Russia. So it's unlikely we might see a comprehensive containment strategy emerging among these states that will try to push back against Russia. So any coordination or cooperation scheme that can emerge as a between the regional neutral states has to be very defined in terms of its scope and very much limited in its also aspiration. So any expansive idea will not fly, particularly by the countries there. And I think the final one of the other important of the Black Sea is that it is a gateway to multiple regional settings in which Russia is also projecting power. So the Black Sea is a gateway to Mediterranean, to Middle East, and in Russian European competition, you see the Black Sea and Mediterranean merging into a single space rather than being two separate space. Because the Russian Mediterranean presence is very much dependent on Russian Black Sea power and assets, and the ability of Russia to move between these two spaces is very crucial for Russia to maintain influence in both places. Like just to give an example, under the name of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, there used to be 6 submarines, and 4 was in Black Sea, 1 was destroyed, and 2 used to be in Tartus naval base in Syria. And similarly, if you look at what has happened since the war, the closing of the straits very much reduced the Russian ability to move the assets between these 2 different spaces, and that is having impact on the Russian Black Sea power. So therefore, the Black Sea is a gateway for Russia in projecting influence elsewhere, like through South Caucasus as well, to Central Asia, through also from Black Sea to Western Balkans or to the geopolitics of the Eastern European. So the Black Sea is quite central. And also Black Sea is central for Russia's global South diplomacy. I mean, around 30% of the grains export in the world goes through the Black Sea. And imagine if Russia has a complete dominance over this, that will be a quite significant leverage that will Russia have vis-a-vis in terms of the food security question in the world. So therefore, this is quite essential. And the final point is that the Black Sea is also a microcosm of the Russian idea of the sphere of influence geopolitics. Because more than multipolarity, what we see actually in terms of Russian aspiration is multi-ordering in the world. So it's not like, you have a different centers of powers in the world. What we see actually, not only different centers of power, but different centers in which different rules apply, different norms apply. So it's not only a geopolitical construction, it's also a normative constructions. So, and you see this clearly, the Russians' sphere of influence geopolitics, which manifests itself more in the form of multi-order rather than multipolarity, manifesting itself in the Black Sea, but also in the Russian so-called Near East. And that therefore the perception of whether the Russia emerges victorious or winner from this war will not only redefine the geopolitics of the Middle East, it will redefine the whole Russian neighborhood strategy. So if Russia is perceived to be a winner from this process, it will embark on a reconstructing or reconstituting the neighborhood in which the states from Kazakhstan to Armenia would be in quite significant trouble. So therefore, this is quite crucial how the Russian sphere of geopolitics will evolve in Black Sea, because it will not remain in Black Sea, it will be about reconstituting the whole Near East.
Thank you very much, Galip, for this excellent mapping of the situation we are. Then over to Natalie, if you can give us your thoughts on this, but also a little bit on the littoral states as well, Bulgaria, Romania, Georgia.
Thank you. It's hard to add to what you have already said.
We wrote together,
We wrote together, so it's a bit difficult. But one thing that is very typical the more I think about the Black Sea is that, yes, it is the region in flux constantly. We've heard that at the first session. Things seem to be changing all the time, and yet so little changes. So I would like to talk about three main constants that are there, that are typical and defining the geopolitical order in the Black Sea, and some variations of the theme, also three, that are changing under the influence of the war in Ukraine. So one constant, which is obvious, is Russia's sense of entitlement to dominate the Black Sea. And even though we've heard Russia is relatively newcomer to the region, nevertheless, it has never constrained its ambition to, in a sense of entitlement. And linked to this has been the fact that the Black Sea area has become basically the main theater for Russia's post-Soviet revisionism. And revisionism defined both in geopolitical terms, but also in normative terms. And I think the normative side of it is very interesting. Geopolitically, you mentioned spheres of influence, but normatively, this approach of differentiated sovereignty. In theory, Russia talks about the sovereign choice, the right to self-determination. This is all good when applied to states further away. But when it comes to neighborhood, it's a very different approach. In some ways, Russia has accepted, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, independence, following the principle of territorial boundaries, keeping Crimea with Ukraine. But at that time, they were sure that Crimea would never really go far away from Russia, that Russia would always dominate, and Ukraine would always be very close to Russia. So this revisionism is also driven, I mean, you mentioned the importance of the Black Sea to go project influence beyond the region, the kind of status anxiety that has always also accompanied Russia's posture. It wants to position itself as the global power, and for this reason, it needs to dominate the Black Sea, create that, it's a very traditional approach, create its sphere of influence, but also use to project influence beyond. The second point, or the second constant, is this contestation, which has always been there. Somebody called it the bloodiest body of water that exists, particularly since this collapse of the Soviet Union. There's been about 10 conflicts, different iterations of it. And Russia has perceived any expansion of the Western presence, NATO, which in a way was generated by its own aggressive policies, as a major threat. But it has been, up until now, quite a lopsided contestation. Russia consistently exaggerated NATO's intentions and the general Western interest over the Black Sea. And the West seems to have consistently underestimated the Black Sea. I mean, it has not moved. It has always been there, but it is only now with what is going on in Ukraine that all of a sudden it became so important and so central to European security, while it has always been very peripheral. And NATO, basically since the end of the Cold War, decided that Russia no longer presented a systemic threat, and it changed its priorities to collective security, reduced funding defense expenditures, while Russia's increased. So it sort of went very much in parallel, and with a lot of misperceptions. I mean, one interesting story is after the war in Georgia, Medvedev said that if we had Mistral warships, we would have taken Georgia in 2 days. And 2 months later, French were ready to sell Mistral warships to Russia. And that deal basically broke down only after annexation of Crimea. So I think it's just indicative how different perceptions were. And the third constant is this connectivity and the connectivity agenda. Because of its location, obviously, it is a natural connecting link. But because of the other two factors, there has always been this kind of securitization of connectivity. It is a point of competition rather than cooperation, although it could be in theory the reason for cooperation. But we discussed this morning the middle competing corridors, importance of middle corridor, China now and Russia trying to get a hold and then all the different states, littoral states, trying to get some. So Russia's basically in the Black Sea, Russia has tried the full range of its hybrid campaign. It has used military intervention, territorial occupation, economic embargoes, energy leverage, manipulating with state minority relations, manipulation of corruption, political cooptation, and of course, information operations. And one of the reasons why it has been quite successful is because the littoral states have all had rather diverging priorities, diverging threat perceptions, and also visions of the regional order. Galip spoke about Turkey's position on regional ownership. I think this is very defining the way Turkey looks at the region, and this is the main area where Turkey and Russia agree when it comes to the Black Sea region. Romania has a very different. Romania has been trying and has been the only one trying to push EU to develop a strategy. Now we know that it's happening, push NATO to develop strategy and increase as much as possible NATO and particularly US presence through whatever ways. So Romania's approach to Black Sea security and its own security has been very different from Turkish. Bulgaria never really considered Russia as the main threat for historical reasons. The narrative of Turkey being the main enemy and Russian liberator is being played out even today. Although now, after the invasion of Ukraine, obviously Bulgaria also feels the risk, but it feels that it is also very weak. There is no navy, there is very little leverage it has to kind of influence the regional order. Georgia and Ukraine have been trying to protect themselves as sovereign states with the integration in the Western institutions, in NATO, Georgia recently, but then have been pretty much stuck in the gray zone and as a result remain quite vulnerable. So these things have always been there, and I think they will remain. I think it's important to know some of these threats in order to anticipate. But there have been some changes as well, which are quite interesting, that are simply variation on these themes. One, I would say, is the expansion of Russia's hybrid activities throughout Black Sea littoral. Before, the focus, I would say, was mainly on the post-Soviet states, preventing NATO expansion, keeping the sphere of influence. Now it seems that the priority is already sort of reversing NATO expansion, the effect of NATO expansion in the Black Sea, and the hybrid operations targeting Romania, Bulgaria, also Turkey. Turkey is specific, but it's not without its own information operations that we see there, use of energy leverage, economic leverage, and so on. And Romania, particularly, we know the interference in elections. But what is interesting and the way Russia is using these operations is that it is very much embedded in the kind of local ecosystem. It's not only Sputnik and RT news, but it's local news. It's the local influencers who sort of take it and then promote that message. It is not creating discontent, but it is using the discontent that is there and manipulating it very effectively using vulnerabilities that are there. It can be social, it can be ethnic, it can be status related. In Romania, for example, Russia is pretty good at promoting a narrative about how West is colonizing Romania, treating Romanians as a second-hand citizens, and so on. And the third aspect, what they're doing quite well is cultivating local proxies, and we see that both in Romania, Bulgaria, and Georgia. Political leaders or parties that are not necessarily by definition pro-Russian. They would not necessarily sell themselves as pro-Russian, but they could be nationalists, they could be fringe, extreme right, extreme left, doesn't matter. But as long as they are anti-establishment, as long as they are sort of promoting the anti-Russian agenda, they serve Russia's interest and would get Russian support. the second, and I'll go quickly now, Russia's policies, as Galip mentioned, has created lots of unintended consequences. And that leads to the creation of new threats from the perception of Russia, and the sort of cycle continues. So expansion of NATO because countries felt like they needed protection. That was one thing you mentioned, and fragmentation of the region. But now Romania feels particularly vulnerable. They look at Odessa and believe, okay, now Russia cannot take Odessa, but it doesn't mean that they will never want to. And that for many in Romania is an absolute nightmare scenario. It would directly destabilize Moldova with all its consequences. Bulgaria is also trying to reduce its dependence on the Russian gas. It's worried about floating mines, shadow fleet, violations of the exclusive economic zone, and of course environmental impact. And Turkey, we discussed, does not particularly want return of Russian hegemony, full hegemony in the Black Sea, as it would support Ukraine. And one of the interesting things here is also, Russia kind of fights against the rise of anti-Russia in Ukraine, but in fact, it has ended up creating just that. Now we have in Ukraine a nationalizing state which defines itself in opposition to Russia. And final point, which is perhaps also a result of policies coming from Trump administration, is that Black Sea security problematic will become increasingly Europeanized. It is a particularly European issue and will have to be dealt primarily by European states. And here cooperation between littoral is very important, but Turkey's and Ukraine's role will be particularly decisive, because really these are the two countries, Ukraine by fighting the war, defeating Russia in the Black Sea, and Turkey by closing the straits, are the main players that have been constraining effectively Russian in the Black Sea. So just to return, you said that the joint sort of littoral containment strategy is unlikely, but given this Europeanization of the Black Sea problematic and potential withdrawal into the US, Ian will tell us whether the US is still interested in the Black Sea or not. I have my doubts. I think it is very important that there is a joint vision of the order that would not fully contain, at least restrict Russia.
Thank you very much, Natalie. And I think you took this to the right direction, because having discussed the littoral states, after all, it's very much a European region. And despite their different agendas, at the same time, we see that we have 2 member states there, 2 candidate states, 3 candidate states. Armenia is also, which is not a littoral, but also in the region. So we do have that kind of European perspective. So I think the rest of the talk will go towards Europe and the United States and NATO. So let's continue with Keir, this discussion.
Okay. I'll pick up where Natalie finished, talking about Europeanization of the problem. I'll arrive at that same conclusion just by a very, very different route, talking about primarily hard power, military power, and how states beyond Europe can make themselves relevant to the problem. And we have to talk about hard power because, as Natalie said, the Black Sea now is the focus of Russian revisionism, but so much of that revisionism is built around military power. It's either delivered by it, or it's intended to facilitate its further delivery elsewhere. And as ever, once Russia has gone down that road, there are a few ways to counter it other than actually matching it with equal and opposite military power. And as we've seen elsewhere on Russia's periphery, the threat is likely to be augmented if there is the wrong kind of ceasefire in Ukraine, or a partial ceasefire, or a confused ceasefire, or one that does not deter Russia from pushing for further advantage. Depending on the terms of the ceasefire agreement, of course, it defines exactly what we will see next, including, as we've discussed at length in the previous session, if Turkey decides that it can ease the closure of the straits to Russian warships, or indeed to warships from other countries as well. What we see, a reinstatement of the use of Crimea to project power forward, according to Russia's long-term project, in exactly the same way as the other bookend of Europe, Kaliningrad in the Baltic Sea. As Galip said, reinstating the Black Sea as a staging area for extending Russia's reach into the Eastern Mediterranean, into the Middle East, into North Africa. There'd also be an augmentation of the missile threat to Southeast Europe if Russia decided that it wished to exert coercion against its perceived adversaries, and potentially, as we just heard, that extension of Russian control along the Ukrainian seaboard or other means of throttling the remainder of Ukrainian maritime commerce. All of these are bad news. So what could external actors like the US and the UK do to influence those outcomes by projecting power into the region? I'll start with the UK. And this is the bit where I really hope that our friends from the FCO and MOD in the room are going to tell me that I'm wildly wrong, because it's hard to see how the UK can actually make itself relevant in those terms. It's true that there's been a high-profile RAF presence in Romania, for example, but that same high-profile, relatively tiny presence is also what's called upon to intervene when it comes to protecting shipping in the Red Sea or protecting Israel from drones. There doesn't seem to be anything left to do there. It's true that the Royal Navy could be relevant with Turkish acquiescence. Again, let's listen to Galip on the Turkish attitude to keeping external actors out of the Black Sea, but not for the time being, because most of the functional remnant of the Royal Navy has been sent to the far side of the planet at the moment, for reasons which have probably been explained somewhere. British Army is now apparently so extended that it cannot stretch any further. The discussions on the so-called coalition of the willing immediately start semi-public conversations about pulling from elsewhere on the Russian front to find the manpower to do it, removing troops from Estonia to cover that relatively tiny commitment. Even more significant, there's the role that the UK might actually play on land. Let's not forget we had less than a 48-hour turnaround from Keir Starmer saying, yes, of course, the UK must be in a leadership role in the reassurance force in Ukraine, to actually, no, we can't do it at all without the United States, which suggests there has been an outbreak of realism within UK defence, or rather an outbreak of honesty, speaking to political leadership about what the limitations of power projection now are, and what the results are of that long-term non-alignment between British military aspiration and British defence budgets. We're soon to see the Strategic Defence Review reporting its findings. The omens so far don't seem to be very good, because it appears that the budget for defence has been set before the threats have been defined, which is the other way around to the normal approach of figuring out the problem and then starting to scope the solution and figuring out how much it's going to cost. Either way, it's possible the Strategic Defence Review might circumscribe British ambition to tailor to its budget, in which case this whole conversation is going to be completely redundant. So that leaves the United States. As we were discussing again in the earlier session, even before November of 2024, there were questions over the United States' strategic vision for this region. What exactly was supposed to happen here? Not least the limitations to US willingness to oppose Russian objectives, as so clearly demonstrated in support of Ukraine. Now we see the Black Sea region subject to the same suspense as the rest of Europe when it comes to the US commitment. There's uncertainty over US objectives, but also over the means that will actually be available to deliver them. On the face of it, it looks as though there's a choice between two very bad options. It's either US complete disinterest or active promotion of Russian objectives at any possible opportunity. But what we haven't seen yet is the start of that active withdrawal, both in physical terms and from policy, of the United States from Europe. The US forces in Europe also seem to be in a state of complete uncertainty. The direction of travel that they are supposed to be following has been signaled, but there's no clear direction on how they're supposed to get there or when they're actually supposed to start. When you visit US military components in Europe, whether it's 5 Corps in Poland, whether it's NATO commitments of the United States personnel to NATO, the phrase that you hear repeatedly now is zombie organizations, and it's a painfully apt analogy, because a lot of them are working with no brain. There's no central direction to actually tell them now what to do, and some of their motor functions are severely compromised because of the restrictions that are being placed on their operations. For instance, they're hamstrung by the convulsions that are gripping the federal government and the administrative fallout from them, like travel bans, which are really tough when your force is deployed on another continent from your homeland, or personnel reduction initiatives that are scything through their civilian staff. But for the time being, they're continuing to do their jobs as though nothing has changed because they haven't been directed otherwise. The other phrase that you hear quite often is, rather than zombie, which you hear in the military, is hostage, which you hear quite a bit from the State Department. The people who are repeating policy lines that are coming from Washington that they know perfectly well are deranged and self-destructive, and you can see in their eyes just how soul-destroying this is, but they go through the motions because they do not have any alternative. But for the time being, Russia will not see a withdrawal of the United States that has been so feared from European security simply because it is not happening. Therefore, for the time being, the US presence remains functional and remains an effective deterrent to what Russia wants to do. The problem is that is different from being a proactive presence that can respond effectively to a dynamically shifting situation and actually take the initiative in terms of heading off any of the negative consequences that we've outlined from a potential end to major combat operations in Ukraine. The result of both of those is that it leaves regional partners on their own in containing what Russia seeks to do and the means that Russia will resort to do it. And this is where we come back to Natalie. It has to be solutions from European states that will constrain Russian expansionism. And in effect, in the region we're talking about, that means that for the time being, it is Turkey that has taken the role of the indispensable ally.
Thank you, Nigel. Now we go to the end with your comments.
Keir.
That was
Oh,
Keir.
Yes, okay. Very good. It's very nice to come home to Sabanadze. I master's degree here decades ago, and back more recently as a visiting scholar in 2019. So in that spirit, I'm going to start with some sweeping academic generalizations and then delve into the more specific questions of actors that the UK asked to speak about. And so draw some connections between the first panel earlier today, which was all about the Black Sea of the region. In that and the substance of our second panel is all about actors and traces. So if we put the Black Sea at the center of our thinking, we are conducting an act of intellectual and policy imagination. We are making a decision to structure or order this geopolitical and geoeconomic space in a distinctive way. And that can be very helpful. And the value of it should not be underestimated. The more we do that, the deeper we go into putting this body of water and literal space at the center of our thinking, the more that we see new connections, new relationships, and new insights. That's often the way if we alter the focus of our attention in this way. And by way of analogy, think back. Did someone say this is the Timothy Garton Library?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, so perfect. That's right. Not the namesake Tin Hash, my dear friend in Timothy Garton, you'll recall the work that he was doing in around 1988, 1989, reviving the concept of Central Europe, yes, and Mitteleuropa, and so on. A conscious, even before the great events of late 1989, drawing our attention away from the dreary and familiar at the time fixed certainty of the East-West division, and encouraging us to think in a different way about connections and affinities based on a different kind of understanding history and culture, and indeed strategic logic, even
moral and aesthetic logic. So I encourage us all to do more about this in respect to the Black Sea. I think it's very, very important. In other words, how we sort of mentally order the map is important to the way that we understand these matters, but also it's important to the actors themselves, including national states. And I think that in this respect, we are catching up with Russia. But Russia's was an important point, I think, that was made in the earlier panel. Russia has been much more explicitly conscious about the importance of the Black Sea than we have. And those conflicts, 2008, 2014, 2022, we are catching up in our sort of policy imagination, what we're thinking about this part of the world. Secondly, in space to time, and my colleagues have already alluded to this point, it's very important not only to see and understand how things are now, but to, from a policy perspective, to look around corners, peer ahead, to anticipate the distinctive shifts and changes that the future might be holding out for. So one is Europe without the United States. What really does that mean? What can Europe do? What decisions must it take now in order to establish the capacity to meet challenges where it really might be facing Russia and the Black Sea and elsewhere on its own, reassured by Keir's points there that, in fact, there is no clear evidence of this yet, but we will see, and no one can rule it out. And secondly, this point about moving from war to, if not peace, at least some form of ceasefire of unknown at this point duration, making sure that that ceasefire is as helpful as it can possibly be to our and Ukraine's interest. It is one of the difficulties, it's always sort of come up at policy level, the difficulties of establishing a ceasefire. You can freeze positions on land, much more difficult to do that at sea. What does that look like exactly? And you recall when talk of ceasefire arose a few weeks ago, Ukraine making it very clear they expected Russian ships not to move from their present positions. There's a real danger that if it's not handled carefully and effectively, that a ceasefire would allow the remilitarization of Crimea, would undo and reverse really significant achievements that Ukraine has made in that respect, forcing the Russian Navy back over the past 3 years. So in other words, a ceasefire, counterintuitively, a ceasefire wouldn't lock in a status quo. And that would be very, very worrying. So finally, something about relationships. In the first instance, of course, we are thinking about Ukraine and its needs, the need to constrain Russia and to help and support Ukraine. I think it's very important for us never to forget in these respects that Ukraine is not only a consumer of security provided by others, but a powerful producer of it. Given its cutting-edge experience now, it understands better than anyone else does what the future of warfare is beginning to look like. In addition to that, its very large military, despite the very difficult losses it's faced, its ability to produce cheaply some of the most modern cutting-edge UAVs and other and seaborne autonomous vehicles as well. So we should never think of this as one way. Ukraine is not just an object, but a subject. We are thinking about Black Sea security and morale. Romania's come up. We can't not today talk about the Black Sea and not at least make mention of what will happen at the weekend for the election. Real worry and real concern. Romania's future policy, whatever good things it's done in the past, hangs in the balance. And then there's Turkey, and again, Keir, you pick up that thread that you left at the end. There is no more country with a complex, one might even say contradictory, set of relationships, putting in different directions with respect to Russia and Ukraine. Really, really, really fascinating. Geopolitically and geoeconomically, seems Turkish policy moves in different opposite directions. There's all the key point about its role enshrined in the Montreux Convention, and so on. That is really very, very important. So now to very briefly, with that in mind, to talk a little bit about the UK. So our drivers, of course, Britain. Your point about problem resources is well taken, and I think we all worry for these reasons, but larger reasons that the Strategic Defence Review was finished by its authors in February, but we still haven't seen it. Will it mention the Black Sea? We'll have to see. But to our credit, if there are worries about questions of resources, I think we can be satisfied to the extent that we have consistently emphasized the threat that Russia poses in a way that typically exceeds many of the countries that are geographically close to Russia. There's a pretty strong tradition here that I think shouldn't be underestimated, and sort of an all-party consensus on it. And in respect specifically of the Black Sea, recall the HMS Defender patrol in the summer of 2021, vigorously asserting, as a traditional naval power should, the freedom of navigation in that region, in a way profoundly unwelcome to Russia. Finally, just on the matter of food security, I do think that our role in the Commonwealth makes us sensitive to the impact, the deleterious impacts of Russian actions in the Black Sea that have led to these disruptions in supply, prices, and so on. But just some conclusions to draw from this. Then I won't go through all the ways that Britain has helped and supported Ukraine and Black Sea security more generally. That's a matter of description, which I'd say is inherently well known, no need to reiterate, and except that the point following from the 100-year partnership signed recently with Ukraine, the grain verification scheme, an innovative way of providing bioscientific expertise to Ukraine to track its stolen grain. Underestimated. But finally, I'll finish on the point really that Keir did. In terms of our diplomacy and the ways that we can engage and influence the countries around the Black Sea, I do think that our relationship with Turkey is really, I'm glad that Ruben mentioned this in the third session, really very, very important. We have a better relationship, it seems to me, a stronger relationship with Turkey than other major European countries, certainly than France, for reasons you know well, for Armenian reasons in particular, but also Germany too. And given the strength of our relationship, and given the complexity and centrality of Turkey to the future of the Black Sea, I think that's something we should pay even closer attention to. So with that, I'll finish and we can take some of that discussion.
Thank you very much, Nigel. I mean, I particularly thought it was interesting and important to say that Ukraine is not just an object, but also subject. In a more scientific language, it's not just a dependent variable, but it is an independent, or at least intermediate, intervening. And with that, let's move to Ian, which is great to see you, Ian, surrounded by your books. And tell us a little bit more about the United States, because we're trying to figure out what's happening. Is it power leaving Europe in the security field, or is it still there, as Keir said? But not very.
No, Othon, thank you very, very much. It's very nice to see. Well, we're both surrounded by books in a sense. First of all, thank you for the opportunity to be here virtually. I'm particularly I particularly regret not being there in person for many reasons. It's a great group and it's a great discussion, but also I have my own connection to St. Anthony's, and it would have been very nice to be there. Well, another time. But and also on behalf of GMF, let me just thank you for this collaboration. Many things have been said, and so maybe I'll focus really on the U.S. piece of this. Just three brief points for you. And decoding America at this point is not an easy task, but it's significant, and it's significant even in the context, I think, of our conversation. And some of you have alluded to that already. Really, 3 points. The first, I think, is that if you look at America's sort of strategic approach to the Black Sea, it's been episodic and it's been fragmented. In many ways, I tend to spend more time on looking at the Mediterranean. There are some parallels here. And of course, they're directly connected, but there are parallels in the sense that even though the United States has been a Mediterranean power for over 200 years, you'll search in vain for anything called a Mediterranean strategy in America. And similarly, you don't find very much discussion of Black Sea strategy, although there have been some attempts, most notably in Congress in 2023, there was a Black Sea Security Act, and there have been, elements of the American sort of strategic class who've taken this up as a kind of crusade in recent years, especially reinforced, obviously, by the war in Ukraine. But it remains a bit esoteric. But it is part of this bigger equation. So if you were to ask, what are our American, traditionally anyway, American strategic interests in the Black Sea? There are three. There are always three of everything, by the way, it seems to be. But anyway, there are three in this case. First, it's obviously part of the European security equation, and that has a certain character during the Cold War, which we don't need to discuss too much, but it was obvious. The second, but today, of course, it's all about the war in Ukraine and restoring connectivity in the region, and the broader question of relations with Russia and Russia's place in the European security order in the future. But anyway, this bigger deterrence and defense equation that the U.S. still thinks about, I would say, even if in a more uncertain way today. The second is there are links to wider strategic interests, looking beyond the region, including Iran, which we didn't talk too much about, energy security, many other things, where the Black Sea is in some ways an element of connectivity, again, not just in a physical sense, but also in a political sense, that the U.S. does think about, even if we don't label it Black Sea strategy. And the third, of course, is a much more direct and sort of policy concern of a day-to-day kind, which is that things go wrong, crises emerge. There are a set of things that the United States has to confront, even in the post-Cold War era in the region, whether it was the war in Georgia, or it was 2014, or more recent experiences where there are simply flashpoints and conflicts and things to be managed that are centered in this region. Again, may not be labeled Black Sea, but it occupies the time of policymakers, and it's part of the equation for any American administration, including, I would say, for this one, even though they take a very different tack with all of this. The United States has, for different reasons, thought about power projection into and around this region historically, but not so much from the region itself, in a sense, not directly because of the limitations on naval transit in the Black Sea, because of the fact that Turkey, among others, has never been too keen on having a higher sort of NATO presence in the region directly. It's not been an easy thing to manage. And that gets to the second point I would make, which is about the relationship with Turkey, which has been mentioned. I mean, the United States, unlike, it's a whole separate seminar, obviously, but unlike the European relationship with Turkey, where Europe and Turkey, in a sense, can't get away from one another, whether the relationship is functional or not, the United States and Turkey both tend to describe our relationship as strategic, but at the end of the day, it's somewhat optional. It's important, but it's variable. And it's never been easy to manage. There never really was a golden age in this. And that's a lot of discussion that we could have. But in this specific Black Sea context, it's quite important because in some ways, Turkey is a key facilitator, but also a constraint. The US has the ability to project power still from Turkey, from Incirlik, and in other ways. A lot of the European missile defense capacity is either afloat in the Mediterranean or it's on Aegis ashore, actually in the Black Sea region. So there is this, but the relationship with Turkey is absolutely critical. And the relationship that Turkey has with Russia has obviously not made it, has not endeared Ankara to opinion on the Hill and elsewhere. It's a complex equation. That said, whatever happens next in terms of ceasefire, stabilization, Ukrainian reconstruction, longer-term security order in the region, Turkey will be absolutely critical. Whether it's about demining or it's about the detargeting of ports and the access to shipping and all the rest of it. And if there is a meeting that takes place on Thursday between Putin and Zelensky, it's going to take place in Turkey. So, I mean, this is, and if Trump has even suggested that he might fly from the Gulf, where he's visiting at the moment, to be part of that. So, I mean, Turkey is absolutely critical. The third point I would make is to answer, well, to pose the question, really, what difference does the current uncertainty in transatlantic relations make? What difference does Trump make? And I think the short answer there is quite a lot. I mean, there is this bigger question about presence, not to say diplomatic engagement necessarily, but the sort of narrower question of the US security presence in Europe and commitment to Europe. And there are big open questions there now. Although I do think it is possible to imagine a future in which the United States has a much, much smaller presence, military presence in continental Europe, but maintains its sort of aeronaval presence in the Mediterranean, relevant obviously to the Black Sea. I mean, that is possible for all kinds of reasons that we could discuss. So there is that big picture security equation that we'd have to answer. The other piece of it is a little on the softer side. My organization has been involved in some of this. Well, the democratization agenda, the larger enlargement questions, broader speaking, in the Black Sea have just gone off the agenda for this administration. The funding has been taken away. The actors who were in this business have gone. It's a whole piece of our engagement around the Black Sea. My organization was very involved in this, but we were not the only ones. It's disappeared. Would it come back? Possibly. We're going to have midterm elections in less than 2 years, and a lot of things could change. But for the moment, that's definitely a much smaller part of the U.S. Agenda. I think, where does that leave us? I think it leaves us rather like, I believe Natalie suggested, that the security order in the future in and around the Black Sea is likely to be more European and less American. A more European NATO, very likely, but will that kind of NATO have more access to the Black Sea, given especially Turkish reservations, than it's had in the past? Unclear to me. So maybe I should just, end on that encouraging note and look forward to the rest of our conversation.
Thank you very much.
Back to you, Othon.
Thank you very much, Ian. And I have, a number of questions to ask, which I'm not going to do. I'm just going to remember in the 1990s, when the Black Sea was a region of cooperation, especially when you compared it with the Balkans, what was happening there, or the Middle East, and how there were many lessons from the Black Sea to be learned. I was just wondering, where are all those regional initiatives? Is there any know-how? My one point that I would mention to Ian's presentation, we don't know what the US role is, but I have to say that Trump's energy is phenomenal. Traveling in the Middle East and going to Turkey possibly, it's amazing how he does it. In any case, let's go to your questions and points. Dimo,
Two quick points in reaction to things that have been said around the panel and the question, hopefully. And my points are predictably enough on Romania and Bulgaria. Romania, I think Nigel brought it up, and it has a complicated history with Ukraine. Which, I mean, Odessa was under Romanian occupation. Our friend Charles King, who happens to be Sabanadze product, has written interestingly, and the Snake Island ICJ case Simeon complicate things there. So just want to highlight. On the Bulgarian piece, there's an interesting story to be told, which involves also the UK. So kudos to the UK for doing it. You might ask the question to Ukrainian military, where ammunition and diesel came in the early days with the battle of Kiev. But then UK ambassador in Sofia hopefully will write up his memoirs, and I'm happy to go further after we're done. But my question to Natalie, but also to everyone else, is around this behavior, hedging, right? I mean, Georgia is hedging now, China is piece of the hedging game. Historically, that was the case in Ukraine under Yanukovych and Kravchuk and Kuchma. That was what Lukashenko used to do in the good old days when Nigel was there. You can imagine a government in Moldova after the elections trying to play this game of multi-vector. So if we pass forward to a situation where actually there's a ceasefire or dialing down of hostilities, will that be more amenable to this sort of behavior in the Black Sea that is highly unprecedented? Or the battlefront will be hardened and you have to pick a side. So Turkey probably can do it, but the Moldovas and the Georgians of this world will be forced by either Russia or Europe or the West to take the side in this confrontation.
Let's see, could you maybe introduce and then?
Yeah, Dimitar Bechev, European Studies Center, Europe.
Okay, let me see other hands. I saw yours. Yes.
Thanks, panelists, and to Ian on the panel as well. My name's David. I work for the UK Mod. I think all of you, in some way or another, have touched on things becoming less clear or needing to think about things in a slightly different way. I wanted to ask, out of the topics you talked about, which bits of them remain murky? The top ones.
Yes, and David.
David Melville, SEESOX. Probably this question is mainly for Ian, but not exclusively. I mean, there must be a lot of people living in the States who have a Black Sea background and a lot of interest in the region. What do they think?
Thank you. So this is the first round. I don't see any more. If I can just add my little question, it's a little bit philosophical as well. Mostly to Ian and Nigel. Do you think that the UK, I mean, we know that there's limited capacity to deal with all these problems, but in this particular instance is the Black Sea, or is it better out or inside the European Union? Okay, let's start.
Shall I start? Yeah, I think the relations between Romania and Ukraine are really very interesting, and there is a lot of anxiety now. And in the previous life where I was working for the OSCE, I actually took part in the bilateral monitoring missions that Romanians and Ukrainians have organized to go and look at each other's key minority areas. And there was a lot of bad blood there, particularly near Odessa, when the two were sort of fighting over Moldovan versus Romanian identity. And what is interesting is the way Russia manipulates this is that on the one hand, if you look at Russia sort of pushes back against Romania because it sees it as one who's pro-US, pro-NATO, and talks about Romania's kind of projecting its own approach and Romania's expansionism and greater Romania. At the same time, it sort of encourages it when it comes to Ukraine. The nationalist leaders do talk about Romania and Bukovina, and Russia encourages that. And the recent examples that we've heard of, Hungarian intelligence services plotting various things in the Hungarian populated Ukraine. I think this also is something that Russia would encourage, dismemberment of Ukraine. If it cannot do it itself fully, it would encourage others to do it and use those tensions that are there, which is why I said they don't create new problems. They just use those vulnerabilities that are and really manipulate it to their advantage. Now, this hedging policy or multi-alignment policy, and will they have to pick a side. I mean, in Moldova, it will very much depend who will win. But I think it may not be quite so straightforward. And the reason for this is that the Black Sea environment now is not what it used to be. And Russia does not have this kind of uncontested hegemony. There is stronger Turkey. So, and there's a very strong cooperation between Georgia and Azerbaijan. Georgia is becoming the weaker partner there, but at least they will try to use it as much as possible. There is growing Chinese economic footprint, and Russia is okay with Chinese presence as long as it's not Western presence, because they believe they share fundamentally the same worldview. It's, you know, defining the areas of influence, and it does not feel at the moment threatened. So in fact, when Georgians say that they bring Chinese investments in Anatolia, the reasoning is, at least the official justification, is that this is much safer than the Western investment because Russians are not going to come and attack it. So Georgia also uses this kind of Chinese presence to balance and bargain and the hedging. And I think that trend will continue because Turkey is not going to disappear from the scene. Ukraine will remain in one way or the other, and I hope Europe understands the importance of keeping Ukraine on the Black Sea for everybody, especially for Europe itself. So that will remain, and I think this balancing, there will be an opportunity. The problem here is that with this increasing hedging, you have a parallel process of diminishing Western influence. And the one that they want to hedge with less is precisely EU and US leading US. One murky area, I think, is really Trump's impact on how things will evolve. And for me, it is fascinating because I look at how Russians use these nationalist leaders, sentiments, etc., traditional values, ideological, cultural wars to promote their position. And these, the same Russian clients, are great admirers of Trump. And how the two are going to divide for their compete for their attention, and how will this actually play out in reality, is quite interesting.
Thank you. Keir?
David asked which bits of what we talked about remain murky and impenetrable. The Russia watchers among us, of course, have this tremendous luxury that we're dealing with a problem that is fairly stable and predictable. Generally speaking, you know what Russia wants and how it's likely to go about trying to get it. The murky and impenetrable bits are more on our side, like British defence policy. And Nigel referred to this all-party consensus on pointing to Russia as a threat, which is absolutely correct. And we've also heard about the way in which, in the early stages of the full-scale invasion, in fact, even before it, the UK was in the lead. What we haven't seen is an all-party consensus on actually responding to the problem in terms of reorganizing this country's defenses against Russia, whether or not that means projecting power into Russia's neighborhoods, at least looking after protecting ourselves at home. Until we see that, and the SDR upcoming, hopefully, may or may not actually be relevant to that conversation, we can't really tell whether the apparent pivot of the new government in this country from class warfare to defense has actually been real and will be followed through on, or whether immigration has now completely subsumed that as the new shiny object that they can be chasing. We just don't know. Relatively speaking, as we also were discussing in the first session, it is unfair to call Donald Trump completely unpredictable, because there are some things on which he too is entirely stable and predictable. You know that he will doggedly pursue the same devotion to furthering Russia's interests in some ways, and that, of course, colors his attitude to Europe and to Ukraine in particular. The unpredictable element of that is the timing. What you can't tell is when this very small group of individuals in the US administration that are directing policy will swing the lighthouse beam of their attention around to a particular issue, and how long it will stay on there for, because they seem to have very limited capacity to stick with an issue, possibly partly dictated by the attention span of the boredom threshold from himself, possibly partly because of the way in which they have highly successfully demolished so many of the mechanisms of government of the United States and of the means of projecting US power abroad, either way, the effect is that issues can be quiescent until suddenly they're picked up and they're focused on by that US administration. So it is as much a matter of the timing as it is of the actual overall policy. So the impenetrable part is predicting that. And it is also predicting the responses of other actors to what Russia is planning to do if they do not have that long-term fixed understanding of Russia as a threat that we do see from some of the profile states.
Thank you.
Nigel? Yeah, what's murky? I speak as an emphatic non-Turkish expert, but been raised and the importance of it recognized. Where will Turkey land? Is there a sustainable stability to what I see as inherent tensions in its policy towards Russia, including with respect to the Black Sea? So, for example, one way of thinking about this, and there are Turks and Turkish experts here to correct me, but geopolitically, roughly speaking, Turkey is inclining towards Western positions. Very, very clear, for example, about Ukraine's sovereignty over Crimea, explicit and unequivocal power. Providing from an early stage in the war, UAVs at scale, was very valuable to Ukraine, and so on and so on. NATO member, of course, because that's saying. Geoeconomically, enabling large-scale sanctions evasion and various other ways in which Russia has been able to withstand the severe sanctions that have been imposed on it. So there was another question about hedging, which I'll come to in a moment. But maybe this is one form of hedging. You point different ways on different kinds of issues. So how that resolves, if it needs to resolve, improve. And then there's the point I appreciate sort of putting the camera back and looking at international politics more broadly now, but this disconcerting truth that underlies everything now, that the most studied political system in the world, which is the American political system, is now the source of greatest political risk. Political risk used to be something that exotic, hard to pronounce parts of the world presented to us. The red bits, peripheral bits on the political risk maps. Because someone used to work in the corporate sector on these things. And the serene greens, the wealthy friends, that's turned upside down there. So what's our working model for White House criminology? And finally, on this point about bringing resources to our resolve. So we have balance of resources and balance of resolve. And at the moment, if we're comparing ourselves in Russia, they are weighted very differently. But I take some comfort, at least, from the fact that if you do the sort of back of the envelope sort of GDP calculation, if you add up Europe's GDP, compare it to Russia, then Europe's superiority in latent material capacity over Russia today is greater than the superiority that the whole of the Atlantic Alliance had over the Warsaw Pact. So that scale of things. The challenge, of course, is turning latent strength into deliverable material. That's a financial matter, a matter of constrained budgets, as much as it is a matter of the underlying economic resources potentially available to you. And ultimately, it's a matter of political will, how you turn the one into the other. Or will we have the political will? That's an issue of great murk. Now, finally on hedging. Yes, it's interesting. So I tend to be skeptical that this much used term, hedging, with all the sort of political science IR literature underpinning it, really applies very much when we're talking about relations with Russia. Not that it never does, but I wouldn't exaggerate that. And as a counterpoint to that, I revive one of the sayings that George Kennan used to have, made about the Soviet Union, but I think it's valid towards Russia as well. Every country that he said that borders the Soviet Union had to decide whether to subordinate itself to the Soviet Union or oppose the Soviet Union. Because the Soviet Union did not have a sort of stable and sustainable concept of good neighborly relations. Now, there are some exceptions to that. Think of, for example, Azerbaijan. But I mean, I think Dimitri mentioned Belarus. When I was there, I watched it at close quarters. It wasn't really hedging. It was a wholly insincere, performative, limited, quickly reversible, pretender of tilt towards the EU when they were being coshed by Putin back in the late 2000s. It wasn't hedging properly, so called, so to speak. And as for other countries, as for I don't know, Bulgaria, Romania, and the likes, I can see. Well, maybe our model here is Hungary. Yes, what do we call Hungary's policy? Is that hedging, or is that just free riding on the EU while elites enrich themselves? So I tend not to. I'm happy to debate it and be corrected, but hedging, I answer. Not so clear to me it has a significant place here.
Ian, yes.
Maybe just 2 points, if I could. I mean, the first on the question that was asked about the domestic political constituency for issues in this region in the United States. I mean, I would say that unlike, this often plays a role in American policy. In this case, I think it's relatively weak, unless we define the region very broadly. I mean, if we're talking obviously about Greece or Armenia, there is a powerful political constituency in the United States that's historically made a lot of difference in American policy. But in terms of the issues we're discussing here today, I think it's relatively weak. I think what there is a rather interesting, given Trump's outlook, a rather interesting reservoir of anti-Russian feeling in the United States, with a lot of different roots, including on the Hill. And I think that could make itself felt. And that's the second point I would make, because I think if you're going to understand sort of Trump's foreign policy, including as it relates to this region, I think, you need to understand three things. First, it's not isolationist, it's hyper-unilateralist. The second is that it's very much dominated by a kind of commercial mindset. I mean, this is an obvious point, but it has real implications here. If you think of the minerals deal with Ukraine, or you think of, his interest in future reconstruction efforts around the region, this is likely to be a part of the administration's calculus. And the third point is that it's highly personalized. And this could make a difference because, and you already see some signs of this, that if Putin turns out not to be very amenable to kind of rapid solutions, as Trump has suggested, he could rapidly shift to something that looks much more confrontational with Moscow. I mean, I really do believe that. It might not be his deep psychology when it comes to the issue, but he personalizes this. He's put some of his reputation at stake on this. He wants something that looks like a win. And if Putin doesn't give it to him, I can well imagine this shifting very rapidly into something that's much more confrontational. And that would have very big implications for what we're talking about here today.
Thank you.
Well, I think I was starting with Dimitar's question, picking side. I think the picking side question is becoming increasingly irrelevant because you have to define the sides. So the idea of the picking sides means that there are sides, and then you have to choose between them. In the first day of the war, there was the West Russia. Now you don't have the West. So when you say picking side, do you mean like aligning with the US or UK or even like with France or with what we were talking about? So I think the idea of the picking side is increasingly irrelevant, and I think going forward, probably the idea of picking side will be much more multiple than we thought that we had. So therefore, these countries will have, because some of these countries probably will pick side with the US against Europe. Some of these countries will have to pick side with European powers against US or Russia. So therefore, I think this is like becoming increasingly relevant. Second, I mean, some of this terminology, I have the inherent dislike to some of this terminology, like anti-Westernism, balancing, hedging. I myself, I use some of them, so I have to confess, not that I don't use them, but most of the time, this is actually mass our inability to account for what is happening rather than to account for what is happening. So it's more about inability because like the question of the concept of anti-Westernism at the time when the West's most important actor, the US, is undermining the whole notion. What does it mean being pro or anti-Western? So I think we have to rethink our vocabulary of how we are discussing what we are discussing now, because it is like more and more becoming irrelevant at the intellectual and policy level roadmap. The third one on the murky question, like what is the murky? Multiple one. I mean, in recent few months, I don't know how many, like conversation with the foreign policy elites of different countries, like France, UK, Germany, etc. that I had. But as a result of them, my idea about what Europe wants to do has not become clear. Actually, it has become less clear. Because like I remember just like having a conversation with some French policy elites, like A, B, C, D, okay, that's perfect, this is the roadmap. And the question is like, are Germans are on board with this? Oh, not really. Are UK are on board with this? 70%. Are Poles on board with this? Not really. So the question is aligning. What is the position, defined position that wants to align itself? Because this is becoming like we have to redefine what is the position that is shared between like some of the key countries that we have to discuss in this regard in a very funny way. I think like just like there was the conversation of Turkey. I think the policy of day one of Turkey and year three of Turkey is more or less the same. Day one and year three is almost the same. Like I said, and probably the year five would be also very similar. With one thing, the Turkey actually from day one to year three has inched a bit more towards the west, not less towards the west. So if there's one thing that is like in a sense like convergence with the west now is greater than what it was 3 years ago. But the question is, we have to redefine the west, etc. Like what is the being convergent with the west? And I think this is like why I think the peaking side question will become less relevant, because it's only the West, like the Trump, can deliver a multipolar world, not the countries that were looking for it. So if we see, and I think one of the biggest geopolitical development of recent times is the decline of the geopolitical West. And I think if this persists, this will give birth truly to a multipolar and post-Western world, and where there will be more sides to choose, not from our extreme sides. And also, Dima, it seems that you read the ambassador's draft, the British ambassador draft. So you have to tell us.
I didn't.
So we have time for another round of questions. Özgür.
Thank you very much. Özgür'ün de tercihte German Marshall Fund. Actually, I would like to continue where I just left and elaborate a little bit on Turkey's balancing act and its relationship with Russia. It was mentioned this morning that the Turkish-Russian relationship is characterized by competitive cooperation, with competition being the dominant mode, while cooperation needs a more deliberate approach. But actually, there is enough historical evidence to also come up with a pattern in this relationship and identify the drivers of competition and cooperation. So in 2004, Fiona Hill and Ömer Taşpınar wrote an article for a policy paper for the Brookings Institution titled Turkey and Russia, the Axis of the Excluded. So in this article, they argued that historically, by the way, not only during the last century, Turkey, Russia cooperate when they are both excluded by the West, and then compete when either both of them or either one of them has a positive relationship with the West. And examples of cooperation are, for example, during Turkey's War of Independence, when both the Ankara government and the Soviet Union were targeted by Western power. During the 1970s, at the height of the Cold War, when Turkey was facing the US arms embargo, and more recently, between 2015 and 2020, when actually Turkey was sanctioned by the United States, Turkey was suffering from the practical arms embargo by EU member states and was facing containment by the Gulf. So this actually gives us an indication of how the European Union could approach Turkey. If Turkey does not feel excluded by Europe, it will not feel a need to get closer to Russia. And as a matter of fact, I believe we are in the early stages of witnessing this happening.
Thank you. What about this? Yes.
Yeah, Chatham House. Two kind of questions. One is, what do you think the Western militaries or militaries in general should conclude from the naval war or the war generally in the Black Sea? I mean, for the UK, it probably means that having very, very large aircraft carriers is a complete waste of money for the defence review. And then the second point of question, I mean, again, this morning there was talk about picking sides. I mean, from my perspective, Russia has nothing to offer Turkey. Right? Its military technology in this conflict has been proven to be completely obsolete. Look at S-400s. Turkey's very eager now to get back on the F-35 program. So, I'm an economist. I mean, Turkey is dependent on the West for finance, trade, and investment. Russia can give Turkey nothing. So I just don't think this is a choice between Russia and the West. Actually, for Turkey, the choice is between the West and greater autonomy, greater defense autonomy, right? And I think we saw in reaction to the war in Ukraine and Russia, etc., Turkey trying to boost defense cooperation, particularly with Europe. And in general, I mean, it's been rebuffed apart from Italy, obviously the Piaggio deal with Baikal. The Germans don't really want to get involved, the French with Turkey, etc. But I guess, if I was the Turks, I'd conclude, and generally UK and other countries, given what's going on in the US, we need greater, at a national level, defense autonomy wherever we can. It's great to cooperate with other countries, but we really can't kind of trust our partners that we thought were partners, right? So I don't know, a couple of questions in there.
Okay, a quick questions, please, because we trained us all. Yes.
So, Dana Allen from the International Institute for Strategic Studies. I have a two-part question. Some of our discussion in the earlier session, and I guess now, has been premised on the hypothetical possibility of a ceasefire.
Mm-hmm.
And so the first part of my question is sort of directed towards Nigel, because you, for a long time, said it's not just hypothetical, but it's delusional. It's not going to happen. Well, that's my question. Have you seen anything, particularly from the Russian side, to change your earlier skepticism? And the second part of the question is to Ian, because you said that you implied that in such an event, to be blamed on the Russians, you could imagine a big swing from Trump. But what would that mean exactly? Would that swing go so far as to re-engage the United States for the long-term support of Ukraine in a continued war for as long as it takes?
Jonathan Taylor, SEESOX. Just to come back briefly to Romania and the rather sort of doom-laden forecast, it seems that people who are voting for Mr. Simeon there are somewhat contradictory, because they are very pro-American, typically, pro-Trump. They're also typically pro-EU and pro-NATO, while at the same time they're very anti-establishment and therefore in favor of somebody who is quite anti-Ukrainian. Now, what we could risk there is having the ring of support in the EU member states which border Ukraine getting very sharply reduced, essentially to Poland, because with Slovakia, which is pretty negative now with the current government, with Hungary, which doesn't allow any that much to go move through. If you then remove Romania as well, that just leaves Poland. Not negligible, but as a in terms of connectivity with Ukraine, it does pose a problem, I think, for the hard security in Ukraine, essentially because of a soft democracy problem in Romania. The political establishment has completely destroyed trust in them. You end up with the guy you end up.
Okay, I think that's the last round. If there's nobody else, we can start with Ian. And Ian, if I can add a question for you, because I'd like to know what is the role of China in all of this? I mean, from a US perspective, does China has any leverage in the Black Sea? I mean, it certainly has interest, but can it be with Russia, but also with its European interests as well?
Okay, well, two things. Let me come to that, but let me also comment on the question that was asked to me about what would a Trump shift, if that's coming, what would that mean in practical terms? Well, actually, Trump has hinted at some of this already, in fact. And I think it would mean a couple of things. First of all, yes, it would probably mean more administration, but also House and Senate Republican support for Ukraine. Whether it would get it back to the levels that we had, I don't know, but it would make it much more likely that it would still be there, both especially military support. I know the financial part, I suspect Trump would still want to leave to Europe. I mean, that balance is what it is, but yeah, but it would make a difference. Secondly, sanctions. Trump has already said that if Putin is not forthcoming, he could imagine not just keeping the sanctions, but reinforcing them. That would be the second thing. And the third, I think, would just be, a kind of more congenial messages about NATO. It would be meaningful, in fact. And we have a NATO summit coming up in The Hague in a few months. This will be an important test, it seems to me, as to where the administration is on that. I've been actually quite surprised, given the campaign rhetoric, pleasantly, if I can say surprised, that apart from these kind of very harsh messages about defense spending and burden sharing, that in fact, the US ambassador to NATO, who was in place very early at a time when it's hard to get people appointed, so the administration had to choose to do that, has been saying, actually quite reasonable things about NATO. Yes, the message about spending is very harsh and etc. But in fact, in terms of the overall commitment, it's been relatively mainstream, I can say. So anyway, those are the areas that I could imagine being reinforced if Putin is not forthcoming and Trump gets angry. On China, Othon, it's an interesting question. China is in many ways the driver here in the bigger picture sense of, whether this kind of over 100-year American pivot to Europe is going to come to an end or shift. It's largely going to be driven by distractions elsewhere. And this, predates Trump, obviously. Trump maybe gave history a shove a bit here, but it predates Trump. And so I think this bipartisan, actually, U.S. sensitivity to China and this much harder line that grows by the day around China, I don't think it's going away. I think that probably if we were having this conversation, a decade from now, we might be talking much more about China and China's role in connectivity in the region and other things. But I mean, the American strategic establishment is very, very sensitive to that, to the evidence of China doing more with partners in the region, with Iran, others. And of course, this core relationship with Russia, which has become part of the complaint about Beijing these days. So, I think that does come into play in the American debate. And I would just underscore again, finally, that it's bipartisan. There are very few things American politicians agree on these days across party lines. A harder line on China, including in regional policy, is one of them.
Thank you. Nigel. Yeah, a couple of things. So, Tim, absolutely right. I mean, it's a very important observation. One I meant to make actually when discussing the question about hedging. What really does Russia have to offer? It has things to offer elites, self-enriching elites, but societies, and that's how it stays its influence. Societies, national interests of others. No, I mean relationships are all about the demand and supply for things that each can offer the other. No, and I think there's a connection here to Ian's observations about at least the potential of this White House turning sharply against Russia. It really is an intriguing prospect because it seems to me that much of, at least a part of what has informed or misinformed Trump's thinking about Russia policy up to now is an exaggerated, possibly kind of Cold War sense of Russia's size and significance. And it's less than 3% of the world economy. And this becomes particularly clear when he has implicitly made comparisons between Russia and Ukraine, unfavorable to Ukraine. Ukraine has no carbs and so on. There's the imagery that is Trump's rhetoric has suggested that Ukraine is some tiny, small, vulnerable country, and Russia is this great sort of behemoth. And that's not true. That's true only geographically and in no other respect. So if the penny finally drops at some point, you realize that Russia really doesn't matter economically and has little or nothing to offer the United States, then again, take up another of Ian's points, the commercialism that drives this White House thinking might sort of push it in other directions. It's really interesting, I think, that you have now on paper a pretty equitable minerals deal struck with Ukraine. That's the commercial deal that that Trump struck. Not anything with Russia, despite the fact that Dmitriev and others have been dangling all sorts of trade deals and investment prospects and so on.
In Moscow. Yeah, there's one in Istanbul.
Well, there you are. Yes. So that's that. And just a couple of kind of, I mean, use the term vibe shift. Who knows? You have quite a Catholic group around the White House now. I mean, some of the root system of intellectuals and so on. So J.D. Vance. Well, who just became Pope? And what did they say? Pretty much on day one. Very clearly, unambiguously critical of Russia as the imperialist aggressor. So let's see what happens. And again, I'm interested in his views on this. Is the root system intellectuals. And one of my guilty secrets is that I kind of follow some of these people just to see what they're saying. Jordan Peterson and so on. Ben Shapiro, no less, came out unequivocally in favor of Ukraine. He paid a visit to Kiev, sat down face to face with President Zelensky, and that was fast-talking Shapiro, influential right-wing kind of media figure, influence and prolific and so on, huge following, was absolutely clear where the moral truth lies in this conflict. So let's see where those things lead. What was the second thing? Military lessons of naval warfare. I'll leave that to the more hardcore military experts, and Keir will certainly have views on this. But obvious point is that Ukraine has achieved major naval victories against the Russian Navy without having a functioning Navy of its own. And again, it's another way of expressing this point that Ukraine is at the cutting edge of what warfare is becoming, the technologies and the tactics and methods. So we have a lot to learn from them. Again, a producer of security and a subject. Finally, ceasefire. Well, we could have another seminar on it, maybe next week back in Arundel House about this. But yeah, I've always been one of those who've taken the view that the loose talk about the prospects of an early ceasefire are very oversold. I think Russia fundamentally has no interest in that, no interest in a ceasefire properly so called, genuinely observed, comprehensive, and without conditions. The sort of thing Zelensky has agreed to, the sort of thing that Trump is proposing as well. So let's see where that lands. And that's partly because Putin's historical psychological obsession, I have to use that word, with Ukraine is so great that the only thing that's more important to him than trying to continue to achieve his goals there is ensuring the survival and security of his own regime. And we're not yet close, I think, to a situation where a moment where pursuing his war aims in the way that he is creating the conditions for a fundamental threat to term. We can discuss how and whether that might become possible. What Russian finances, I think, Russian economy is in much more trouble, I believe, cumulative difficulties than most people realize. And the final point on this, if Putin were now to agree to this condition, a genuine, unconditional, properly observed, and of significant length, that would mark a quite fundamental shift in Putin's position. Something he has, in terms, rejected up to now, without trying to explicitly reject it. But in terms he's rejected it, that would send all sorts of interesting. That would signify, that would radiate weakness, and that would have all sorts of second-order consequences, including with
Yeah.
I'll try to be super brief then and just tackle the other half of that question from Tim. Because Tim, as you know, that question about whether carriers has been obsolete has been a fierce and ferocious debate since even before the Royal Navy's current carriers were laid down. But the real questions that are coming through now are even deeper than that. It's whether carrier delivered air power has question marks over it now, given what's happened in the Red Sea over the last few weeks and what's happened in Ukraine over the last few years, the limitations on the use of air power by an ostensibly far more powerful air force that have come through. All of those are shaping, hope, are shaping conclusions by Western militaries about the latest revolution in military affairs and how not to be behind by it. And I won't surprise anybody by saying that this is a once in a multi-generation opportunity generate armed force in a way that is relevant for the coming conflicts. The problem is it's not just equipment, it is strategy, it's doctrine, it's political foundations of warfare. Every single assumption is now being challenged, not least because, for example, many Western European countries have always assumed, for several decades, assumed that they'll only go to war as part of a coalition and states. If that's not true, you have to change everything, force structure, doctrine, everything. And so just to give one single example that rams home just how vital this is for the moment, one thing that has been demonstrated beyond any possible doubt by both Russia and Ukraine is the key role in next wars of ultra-long range precision-guided munitions. And here we are in the UK, in a country which is relatively determined to annoy Russia, that has been practicing for a very long time delivering ultra-long-range precision-guided munitions. And we're sitting here without an integrated air defense system. That's just one example of the kind of thing that has got to change.
Yeah, a few points. I think it's very interesting, this strategic autonomy question in the context of Turkey and whether that means being anti-Western or autonomous. From Russian point of view, it's the same thing. This may not be the same thing from Turkey's point of view, but from Russian perspective, they are very keen to support Turkey's autonomous position because that means shielding Turkey from the influence, whether it's EU, NATO, moving closer to the cooperation with the West, exactly what you're saying. So they would be supportive of this autonomous position from the way they see it. This may not necessarily be how Turkey sees it. And I'm not quite sure Russia has to have something to offer necessarily in order to reach its objectives. What it needs to do, and so far that's what I think Moscow's strategy has been, they know they don't have all that much to offer. That's why partly the emphasis is so much on information operation, capturing narrative, using things that's easier and more available for them. What they need is to galvanize support to basically challenge the status quo, whether it's regional, global, etc. And for that, they have they're on the same page. with China, with some regional actors, and today might be on the same page with the US administration, who's also not happy with the global order. So the negative kind of mobilization can be sufficient. On ceasefire, I have always wondered why Russia did not take that ceasefire off, and why I understand the position that they're not interested. They've got other things to do. There are different plans. They could have bluffed. They didn't have to, which they've done many times, really go for real ceasefire, implemented, respected, etc. They could have bluffed implementation, but at that time, that created opportunity for maybe put pressure on Turkey. We discussed that earlier on opening the straits and reinforce the Black Sea fleet and really reverse what has been the defeat of Russia in the Black Sea. But they haven't done it, so surprise. On Romania, Hungary, Slovakia, obviously, this circle is truly reducing, and I think that is the objective of Russia. And here, I think you're right. I mean, because there are these nationalist forces, they have their own interests that are not necessarily exactly the same as Russian, but in this kind of the same logic as being autonomous is kind of translates as an advantage for Russia. I think this is what is happening there. I mean, Georgescu would have been the best option for Russia. Now they go after the second best, and maybe it won't work because apparently he did dreadfully at the debate. I don't know. But Hungary is a major asset for Russia, and Hungary has its own. I mean, I think Orban has his own agenda, but Russia uses Hungary so well, including in my own country, in Georgia. I mean, Orban is one of the enablers for Russia to project influence in Georgia and give it a European facade for something that is very pro Russia.
Thank you.
Well, I mean, first let's start with ceasefire. And I think that's where we need to have a big conversation. When I say we, that means the major European states, Turkey, Ukraine, so the countries that have a skin in this game. And what are these coalitions willing? If the Trump goes for the ceasefire deal, and what is the different scenarios that these countries are willing to prepare for? And what are the costs that they're willing to pay for it? Because whether this ceasefire works or not, I think we might have, we might all have a different expectation from this. I also don't think that it's also going to work, and its name is ceasefire. It's not anything. So it's probably not going to go last long. But the question is, if it works, what does it mean for Europe? If it doesn't work, what does it mean for Europe? And what is Europe willing to do? So that's the first one. Second, there is not, I don't think right now there is a set policy positions of Europe that we can talk about. And that's why it's crucial, once again, being in the same room for the countries that are going to play a fundamental role in this process. Again, the UK, the EU willing states, not EU as an institution, probably some of the major European states, Turkey, Ukraine. So a much more structured conversation about to align their perspective before they align their policies. I think first there needs to be an alignment of perspective before we align our policy. The final point is on this so-called, again, in your question, what Russia offers to Turkey. And because that also presupposes that, Turkey or a country like Turkey, they think about what each actor offers, and accordingly they make a decision. And I think that this is what motivates the policy of these actors are not the Grand Bazaar style negotiation. So it is not that you are engaging in a Grand Bazaar style negotiation. I think that the geography and history and experience is matter. So you really have to take into account, for instance, if you move UK to where Turkey is now, and if you move Turkey where the UK is now, the policy will not be the same because the geography is not the same. At the end of the day, the policy of the actor is to some extent is the outcome of the geography and history, and then the experience. So therefore, you have to take into account the geography, history, and experience of these respective countries in the account. And that's why Eurasianism in Turkish context, the pro-Russian Eurasian, is not a geopolitical vision. It is an ideological position. At the core of it is the discontent with the West.
Thank you, Galip. I'm afraid we have to stop this very exciting and very interesting discussion because we need to take you to high table in the college. That was a great event. Thank you all for coming. It wasn't neither optimistic nor negative. It was very much realistic. So it was a great discussion. Galip and I did say that this should be the first one, and then next year, the way things are going, running fast as they do, there will be major developments. So let's make an appointment for next year. Ian Lesser can make it next year as well. He sold Tony and home. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to our speakers for this session, to our speakers for the first session, to the participants. It's been fantastic. Well done.